Welcome back to the Matt Return podcast. I'm your co-host, Zach Allen.
And I'm Kaleb Boyer.
And we are back. Happy Valentine's Day first to you, Caleb, and all our wonderful viewers out there. Just a couple days ago, actually, we had some Monday Night Wrestling. Penn State defeated Rutgers, not only defeated Rutgers, crushed Rutgers at their annual Bryce Jordan Center dual meet, 35-3. It was close like the first two matches, and then it wasn't close after that. So I think we should briefly talk about that first. I don't think there's a lot to necessarily discuss outside of the obvious, which we'll get to here in a minute. But Caleb, I guess what were your biggest takeaways from that dual meet?
I mean, right away I want to talk about the video review not working. I don't think I've ever seen that in any sport. I mean, that's pretty wild. You're talking about not only is a requirement by the Big Ten to have video review, it just not being able to review any sort of call at all. I know Rutgers, I think, did they try to challenge one or two times for the back points on potential back points on Braden. I don't think I've ever seen that. I don't know about you, but
yeah, I think, and definitely while we were covering that, I was seeing it go all around Twitter. I don't know if it was probably just a technical error. Like, you can't go into a dual meet in a basketball arena, especially. Like, they have it in Rec Hall, but then you go to Penn State's basketball arena, a bigger venue with, more money put into it, and then the video review system doesn't work. I thought it was pretty questionable. I don't really know what happened there. It's not like I don't think Penn State's trying not to have video review. It's not allowed. But I really do think that was just a one-time thing. We've seen them review many times in Rec Hall, which I saw going around on Twitter. There's people like, well, how many times has Penn State done this? How are they allowed to have a home duel? And it's like, well, it was at a different venue. The switchover probably caused some problems. But yeah, that was an interesting tidbit and what ended up being a blowout. I think my personal takeaway was just the depth that Penn State has. Again, I mean, it's not really a secret, but you have Terrell Barraclough, who I remember covering last year, was 157 pounds. He bumped up to 165, and then he's wrestling this ranked kid from Rutgers, beats him, not only with his quickness, but a full third period ride out when you're exhausted from a previous two periods of wrestling. That's pretty impressive. And then obviously I think even more impressive was Lucas Cochran beating a top 10 heavyweight when he's listed. He's only really wrestled at 197 pounds. That puts him at a huge disadvantage. And they both came away with ranked wins, which I don't think really many of us expected, or at least I didn't. So I don't know about you, but.
well, I mean, Lucas came in and he weighed in at like 196 pounds, I believe was his weigh-in. So you're talking, he's wrestling a kid like upwards of 50 pounds or potentially way more than that. To just not even come out and win. Like, you win 2-1, it's still an impressive win, but he comes out and he handled that match.
Yeah.
Like, there was not really a portion of that where he was really not in control. I know Yara escaped to make it like 4-2, and then Lucas got that takedown and sealed the bout.
Mm-hmm.
But, I mean, at no point did he not have complete and utter control of it.
I really think those, like the video review thing and those two guys, were really all you could take away from it. Other than that, Penn State has a sickness that's been going around for a couple weeks now. But yeah, it's just come back to the same old. Penn State blows out a team, on to the next. But I feel like personally, Nebraska on Sunday might be the best team that Penn State will face all season. I know they faced Iowa, Michigan. Neither of those were really close. I personally am. This was probably the dual meet I was most excited for when I saw, the schedule come out, especially because we finally get to cover a big-time meet at home this season. We haven't really gotten the chance to do that. I guess Ohio State, but that turned out the same as most other dual meets. Is there a chance at all Nebraska can win? And I guess a more pressing question is, what weights can Nebraska take?
That's a really good question. So I'm thinking 125. I don't see Braden losing this one, but it's definitely possible dropping one to Caleb Smith, transfer from, I believe, App State, right? 133 with how Aaron's been performing lately. Again, I don't think that it's a match he would drop, even with the struggles. His only losses are to top 11 wrestlers. I think they're all top 10 now after he dropped out of the top 10. But Brock Hardy at 141. That is an interesting matchup with Bo Bartlett. I wouldn't expect Tyler to get a win here. It's going to be a very difficult match for him. He's wrestling the number one wrestler in his weight. Then obviously 157, you got that rematch between Peyton Robb and Levi Haynes. So those are all bouts I think that they could potentially win.
Yeah, I also think 184 too is looking good for Nebraska.
That was an oversight on my part.
No, there's a lot of them. There's a lot of good ones for once this upcoming weekend. I think I don't think Penn State's going to lose, obviously. I think there's a very high chance they win, but I think Nebraska probably has the best chance of any opponent this season to maybe knock off Penn State. All it would take is, a few upsets. Like you said, I think, Aaron Nagao has struggled. He did beat Cullen Shriver last week, who was kind of ranked around number 20. Brock Hardy and Peyton Robb, even though they're lower ranked, they're still really great wrestlers that I think could pull off upsets. Although Bo Bartlett is arguably one of the best wrestlers, maybe pound for pound right now, after his last weekend. And then, 184. But in the end, I think it's just going to be Penn State gearing up for the postseason. I think, again, maybe, as I mentioned before, maybe another factor that could alter the result is who knows who's sick for Penn State now, or if they're totally better. It could be either way. We didn't see Carter Strachey or Greg Kurtfleet wrestle, even though Greg was, mentioned at the start of the dual meet that he was going to wrestle. And Aaron Brooks, Cale said, was dealing with something against Rutgers as well. So that's definitely something to watch out for. But yeah, I think in the end, Nittany Lions will get it done. I do want to talk about something beyond just dual meets. With the postseason coming up, I think it's a good time now to maybe talk about the state of the sport as a whole. I was watching the Nickels and Dimes podcast with Bo Nickel and Johnny DeJulius, and there was one part of that podcast where it just brought up a lot of great points to me that I thought were worth discussing. Obviously this year the national championship is in Kansas City. Last year it was in Tulsa. Year before it was in Detroit. But every year it's like he brought up in the podcast, Johnny did, there's been just a decline of viewership. And, I think that's because it's really not on streaming services other than like Flow Wrestling, and it's more just on cable, and it is on ESPN. But, to get on those streaming services, there has to be a demand that's met, so the streaming services can profit, obviously. So, Caleb, I guess just in general, I know I sent the clip to you, and you watched it as well. What do you think is maybe one of your more pressing issues with just the decline of viewership we've seen, and how can the NCAA, the Big Ten, these programs individually even kind of increase in interest in wrestling?
Well, they do talk about it in the podcast. obviously during that time of year you have March Madness going on. We were talking about earlier. We would watch. Well, Penn State was in the tournament, I remember, and somebody had it on the laptop, and we were watching that right before. I don't remember if it was session 1 or session 3. I don't remember which day it was for Big Tens, but you're competing with one of the biggest sporting events in the world, obviously in the United States. So trying to just put yourself out there with that other sporting event, you're not going to win out. I mean, regardless of if somebody is a let's say someone's a casual wrestling fan and a casual college basketball fan, they're going to watch March Madness because people are way more intrigued and excited by it. I think that maybe if you were to move nationals maybe like a week before or move the postseason a week before or a week after, maybe it might offset it a little bit, but there's just got to be something different on there.
Yeah, and I remember before you were even on the beat, we were in Detroit, and it was the year St. Peter's made their run to the Elite Eight, and it was the first round, and they were beating Kentucky, and again, I think it wasn't just one guy having the laptop at that point. There were no Penn State wrestlers on the mat. We're not watching March Madness while we're supposed to be covering wrestling, but when there's not a Penn State guy and there's a massive upset that you see is going on, and obviously we're on Twitter during these matches, we're going to gravitate towards that, and we're in the stadium, and it wasn't just me, it wasn't just another guy, it was like a massive amount of people that were watching March Madness while being at the national tournament. And we're in the stadium again. People that aren't in the stadium and are just at home, they're, like you said, they're just not going to watch wrestling unless they're a huge wrestling fan, their kid wrestles and they're trying to teach them something. That's pretty much it. Or if they have a family member wrestling. It's never going to take the priority. And I think, maybe not move it up because conference tournaments are like right before that and it's still a little before the actual national tournament starts. But maybe like moving it, like he said in the podcast, I think moving it to April would be great. Because that's around when the basketball tournament finishes. And then, really nothing's on after that for a while. I guess there's the Masters, which, you can compete with. People aren't all golf fans.
Yeah, and you'd be just before baseball, so you wouldn't be cutting to that either.
Yeah, but viewership has been a real issue. Last year, it dropped from about, I looked it up before this, like 630,000 in 2022 to 450,000 last season. And it wasn't because it switched from ESPN to all streaming services like Flow Wrestling. They were both on ESPN. And I think, especially as we see the decline of cable television as well, I know my family dropped cable television and like literally just last year. And now it's all this YouTube TV stuff. And, Big Ten Network does show up and, we can watch, Penn State and Nebraska and all these Big Ten dual meets. But for the national tournament, even though it's on ESPN, people are going to watch something else. And I think that is probably the most pressing issue. And I think we've heard Cale Sanderson all the time talk about making the sport more exciting, trying to cater more to fans a little bit. I mean, the last few dual meets at home, they've added music in Rec Hall and the BJC because he said, it gets quiet while the wrestlers are wrestling. If a guy's, hand fighting, stalling, and you can't just go in blindly and try and get a takedown to wow the crowd. This isn't the WWE. They're competing. And so we've seen measures like that be taken. And, I think that's number one. You just can't compete with the likes of March Madness. I don't know about you, but I also thought my number two issue, which, it's kind of a stupid issue to have, but I can't tell you, to be transparent, we've both never, we weren't competitive wrestlers, which I think is why we should be able to talk about how to grow the sport. We are fans of the sport. We didn't participate in the sport. We're fans of the sport now because we covered it and we've had an interest in it. And now I love wrestling. Started my interest in watching the UFC as well. I think when I try and get other people into the sport, it's a stupid and immature thing, but almost every time, like I'm like saying to one of my roommates or one of my friends, like, hey, you should check out the Penn State wrestling match one of these times. It's a cool sport. It's like, oh, what, watch two dudes cuddling, and they talked about it on the podcast where they would mandate a two-piece set rather than the traditional singlet, which I don't think the wrestlers would like at first. But I think, not to say you should cave into this argument that people have. I mean, you and I don't know it's not like that. Wrestling fans know it's not like that. The wrestlers themselves know it's not two dudes cuddling. But I don't know why it's a stigma around the sport, but it is. And I think he brought that up on their clip. I think, maybe mandating the two-piece sets might eliminate that a little bit, which is unfortunate that, we even have to have the discussion of, like, pandering to that. But I don't know about your thoughts on that personally.
I've definitely heard that a lot. I know when I talk about wrestling I know a lot of people I know personally. And my brother wrestled in high school, but outside of that, nobody really, like, in my family cares or has ever watched wrestling outside of maybe, like I said, if they went to one of my brothers when he was in high school, which would probably be just my parents. But I could see the argument for wanting to do a two-piece, but I think a big problem is you're getting rid of, like, the iconic kind of way they've done it for years. And like you said, I don't think people would be happy with it, especially the wrestlers. I think they talk about it on there. Like they said, maybe in a decade, maybe in two, they would look back and be like, "Oh, I can't believe people ever wore singlets to begin with, just because of the nature you talk about." I mean, I do see the argument for both sides because you kind of want to grow the sport and you want to make it more accessible and entertaining for the average person. But at the same time, you might have to give up, like, some of the things that make the sport so iconic for the rest of the fans. So it's kind of a tough topic.
Yeah, I mean, what would you do? Like, what would you prefer? Them remain in the singlets or with this negative connotation around it? Or maybe, to grow the sport some more and get some more eyes on it, you have them wrestle in just a two-piece set.
Well, I'm not sure how much would you think it really solve it? Like,
Yeah, I guess that's true.
Because I'm not sure.
Because if they're not a fan, who's to say they're gonna, go to Rec Hall anyway and watch it? I just think a big part of maybe growing the sport might be eliminating that mindset, which I personally never thought of it like that, but I don't know. I think it's definitely an issue, which is kind of is really dumb in itself, but it's just something to think about. I personally like the singlets. I think they're cool. I think it's a unique uniform rather than a guy pulling up in Penn State shorts and a Penn State shirt and they're just wrestling. But yeah, I don't know. That to me was just a talking point of that. Really, I was like, oh yeah, I relate to that, because not because I'm a wrestler, but because when I try and get people to go, that's what they say. So
They could try to that could be a solution if it was like they try growing the sport in other ways and they still can't. Like, I know the other legendary Penn State wrestling coach, Coach Spidell, he used to go out at, like, little camps around the state trying to get people to, like, wrestle, because back then, like, you had to basically be your own recruiter. He had to find guys who would wrestle for him. So I think if coaches and, like, teams alike took more of an active role in trying to do that, like growing the sport in like middle schools and elementary schools, it would probably breed a more acceptable culture first. But I mean, there's not really a easy way to get rid of that stigma because people are just they're going to think what they think, and you know what I mean. There's not
Yeah,
much you can do about it.
yeah, that's true. I guess I don't know. It was just something to think about, and I think, the last thing is, they brought up having the same location every year, like you said, the College Baseball World Series does. I personally didn't agree with that one, just because I think, like the Super Bowl is in a different stadium every year. But I think the venue does matter, and I know last year, um, people were not happy about it being in Tulsa, and just I know for us it was kind of a hassle to get down there, um, but when we loved Tulsa. Like, this is not just, you know slandering the city of Tulsa, Oklahoma, but I think, if you want to grow the sport, it can't be somewhere hard to get to. Um, just because people aren't going to go through the hassle to do it. And plane tickets were so much more expensive than when it was in Detroit the year before. Um, Even though we ended up driving to Detroit, I remember looking at the plane tickets, and not everyone is going to have the money to fork over. I think for us, what was it, like $800, $700?
Yeah, something like that per person to go out.
Yeah, and so it's now it's not out of our pocket. Like, we got reimbursed for that, but the normal fan is not going to get reimbursed to go to Tulsa, Oklahoma. So I guess what's your opinion on that?
Well, first off, like you said, PSA, Tulsa was really fun. It was a great city. It was.
Yeah,
It's just very,
inaccessible.
yeah, it's inaccessible. There's not a lot of hotels uh, in the city area. I know we missed the media hotel, so we had to like get a hotel and Uber there every single day, and it was like that got expensive. Like you said, we were reimbursed, but like
There were people staying in our hotel also that were fans and
yeah,
not getting
there were quite a
reimbursed.
few actually.
Yeah,
So, but moving on, like I think that having it in one location kind of takes away from you're not making the rounds of the country. You're not making it. And he's like, yeah, it's people aren't going to want to travel to a different place every year. I'm like, I mean, what do you mean? So if I'm someone who lives in Oregon and they're hosting in Tulsa, or that's a bad example. If someone's in
California.
Illinois and it's like, for example, this year in Kansas City, you'd be able to drive pretty easily, but Tulsa's going to be a lot less accessible. So if every year you're hosting it in Tulsa, that's going to be a lot less accessible if someone wanted to
Yeah,
go.
I did agree. It should kind of be focused more towards the Midwest or the South, just
Mhm.
because other than California, really the major hotbeds are, Iowa, Pennsylvania, Oklahoma, which I think is why they had it in Oklahoma, is because Oklahoma State specifically is it's such a storied program and hotbed for the sport. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I feel like to have it in one location, that had to be like set in like the early 1900s, mid 1900s, just to establish the tradition, like Williamsport for the Little League World Series, and things like that. But yeah, I mean, I don't know if you had any other thoughts about the sport in general. I feel like those three to me were I think the biggest questions that had to be answered. Um, what do you think Penn State can do individually
Well,
to?
I've seen it talked about a lot. People, I think, I don't I don't think this is true, but I think people think that Penn State being so dominant and teams being so dominant in years past, like before Penn State, it was a lot of Iowa. Before Iowa, it was a lot of Oklahoma. Almost said Oklahoma City, Oklahoma State. Uh, I mean, the does the too much of one team winning, do you think that impacts people wanting to watch it?
I mean, I'm not necessarily. I don't think so. Because in the end, the tournament is individual, and Penn State had what 5 wrestlers in the national championship, or their individual ones, and only 2 won. While Penn State did dominate the team race, I still feel like people tend to gravitate, at least on the national stage, towards wrestlers from their school. And maybe that's because Penn State has just, in recent years, been the team to beat. But I still think there's that loyalty. Now, as far as dual meets, maybe, but I think just the NCAA tournament, Big Ten tournament, people are still gonna root for the athletes from their school. At the end of the day, that's my opinion. I don't think I'd have a problem with it, but
Yeah, and I think that as the postseason goes on and the tournament goes on at nationals, obviously the bouts get more and more exciting. Like you have the blood rounds, you have the semifinals. I mean the Shane Van Ness semifinal against Yanni last year, that was an insane match, and there were, obviously the finals as well, the championship games.
Yeah.
Or matches, excuse me.
But yeah, I think that's all I personally wanted to discuss. I don't know about you.
I think that's all I had too.
But yeah, that'll be all from us. Let us know what you think in the comments, because again, we weren't competitive wrestlers. We're just fans of the sport that cover the sport and are trying to see its growth. But we'll be back next week for our next episode. Next Wednesday is when we film. But yeah, Penn State's taking on Nebraska. That's next in line, and then what is it? One more dual meet, and then the postseason. So season's already coming to an end. But again, I'm Zach Allen.
And I'm Kaleb Boyer.
Peace.